Hey everyone, this is Turnbay again. And aside from being a professor here at Eve University, I'm also a server admin and I'm one of the managers of the Eve University web development team. So this video is going to be about how to set up a virtual web development host with the VirtualBox software. It's aimed primarily at the E-UNI WebDev team as one of the solutions for setting up a local dev environment. But I'll probably make this video public for anybody else who wants to learn how to set up a virtual system using VirtualBox. So in this video, we're going to be talking about our final goal for what we want to do. What do we want to set up, and what is the list of software that we're going to need to do it. We'll talk about where and how to download both VirtualBox and CentOS, or as we'll see later, you could install whatever other operating system that you want. And also we're going to be going over how to create the virtual machine and then set it up so that we can access it from the outside. So these last two parts is probably going to be where the bulk of this video is going to be spent, because usually when people have questions or they encounter any problems, this is where it happens to occur. So we'll be going step by step to show how to set up the VM itself, and how to install and configure our Linux distro, and also how to set up the firewall, the services, and the ports so that it can be set up as a fully functional development or test environment. So what's our goal and what do we need to accomplish it? Well, our main goal is to set up a virtual machine that contains everything we need to at least emulate the Eve University production server. Then you can use this VM for, at the very least, testing the software that you've developed. Or if you really wanted to, you can even use it as your own dedicated development machine. So because it's a VM, you won't need any dedicated hardware like a whole new computer to have a dedicated dev or test system. It'll run as a virtual machine on your current computer, but it'll be separated from it so that you can still use it. You could still use your computer itself without having to do anything like, make a dual boot setup to be able to run a completely different operating system. You also won't have to worry about messing up the VM because it won't affect your host computer. So if something goes seriously wrong, then at the very worst, you'll have to just delete it and then follow these steps again to create a brand new one. So to set it all up, we'll need the VirtualBox software itself. It's maintained by Oracle, but it's entirely open source, so it's free and it works really well. And that's the main reason that we're choosing to use it for this. Also, it runs in Windows, Macintosh, Linux, even runs in Solaris if for some reason you're using Solaris. I'll also be using CentOS in this video as my Linux distribution of choice. But you can actually use any Linux distro you want and just install that into the VM. You could use Ubuntu, Fedora, Gentoo, Mandrake, whatever distro you like best. Or heck, you could, if you really wanted to, you could even install Windows. I believe any version from NT through Windows 7 is supported by VirtualBox. Or again, if you really wanted to, you could install Mac OS X, or you can install Solaris, BSD, you can even install MS-DOS, but I wouldn't recommend trying to run both a web server and SQL server under MS-DOS. But one thing to keep in mind, though, is that if you want to install a commercial operating system, then you will still need another license, even though it's running under a version of itself. Like, for example, if you're running Windows 7, and you want to create a VirtualBox that also runs Windows 7, you will need a second license for that second copy of Windows 7 because it's technically another machine running Windows 7, even if it's just a virtual one. And finally, we'll want to also use Apache with PHP and MySQL. We can technically use any decent web server, and in fact, the E-UNI production server system uses Nginx. But Apache comes pretty much free with every Linux distribution. So, and also remember that any apps or tools that you make for Eve University, they should not need to have a specific brand of web server anyways. So your software should be able to run both under Apache and Nginx. We're using PHP, obviously, because that's our server-side language of choice, so we'll want to make sure that's installed. And also MySQL, because that's our database engine of choice. So we'll use all these pieces of software, make sure that they're installed, and they are also all freely available. So where do we get all this good stuff? Well, here you go. It's not a trick question. But we'll go through all the steps because, especially for the Linux distribution, sometimes people who haven't tried to download one before can get a little bit lost. So again, we'll go over the steps in detail on how to grab them and exactly what you need to grab. So here we are in our web browser, and one thing that you're going to want to pay special attention to when going to these sites is to make sure that you get the URL correct, especially for VirtualBox, because if, for example, we go to www.virtualbox.com, we will actually go to something like this or something that looks very wrong. It actually goes to a bunch of different sites, but if you take a look at the slide again, you'll notice that that is not the correct URL. You want to go to www.virtualbox.org. Make sure to go to that address, and you will, and make sure that you spell it correctly, by the way, and you will go to this site, which is the correct site. So to download Oracle VirtualBox, this one is super easy. Just click here on the left side, Downloads, and you'll see a list of the VirtualBox binaries. And just select the binary for your particular operating system. x86, AMD 64 use the same binary. So for in my example, I'm running under Windows, so I'm just going to click on here to download the x86 AMD 64 VirtualBox 4216, which is the latest VirtualBox as of this recording, and then I'll just save it for later. Now for CentOS, pretty much the exact same thing. You want to make sure to not go to CentOS.com because the correct URL, see, CentOS.com goes to CentOS Central Logistics GmbH. The correct URL is CentOS.org. And again, you can use any Linux distribution you want. I just prefer CentOS myself. But no matter what Linux distribution, chances are that you're going to see the same structure or the same general type of structure as you're going to see here. So for those of you who have not downloaded a Linux distro before, where you want to go to is Downloads, Mirrors, and here you can see that the CentOS site actually has a link to the mirror list from this page. Don't click on one of these. These are just the CentOS sponsors. You'll want to click here on the CentOS public mirror list. So this link will take you to the list of mirrors, and then you just want to select one of these mirrors that might be near where you are, because that will probably give you the best throughput. So I'm just going to choose US California, one of these at pretty much random. Actually, Stanford University I use pretty often because I've had pretty good throughput with that, and you could download it via HTTP, FTP, or rsync. I just use HTTP. I'm not going to actually download it here because this is something that is going to take a while. But click on HTTP and you will see a lot of different folders. The first thing you want to look for is essentially the latest version. So we will want to click on the 6.4, which is the latest version of CentOS as of this recording. When we go into 6.4, we'll see a bunch of other folders, and this is where people who have never downloaded a Unix or a Linux distro get a little bit confused. What you actually want to go into for the purposes of setting up our VirtualBox is the ISOs folder, the ISOs folder here. So we click on that, and we want to choose either i386 or x86 64. Typically for development, for a development system, especially for a virtual development system, I'll just go ahead with the i386 version, which is the 32-bit version. The x86 64 is the 64-bit version of CentOS. But since this is going to be running under a VirtualBox, and we really don't need, all of the extra, well, the extra whatevers that you'll get out of the 64-bit version, the extra performance, the extra memory addressing, and so on and so forth. I just go with the 386 version, but it's entirely up to you which one you want to download. They will both work under VirtualBox. And under here we could see a list of all sorts of stuff: text files, ISO files, and torrent files. We are actually interested in the ISO files, but not the live CD files or the live DVD files. What we want are the binaries here. So this one, these 6 0.4 i386 binary DVD1, and if you wanted to, you could also get the second DVD here. The first DVD is 3.5 gigabytes, so as I mentioned earlier, this is the reason why I'm not going to actually download it all over again. I've already downloaded it before. So I could just right click on this and choose Save Link As, and that will actually download the entire 3.5 gigabyte ISO file. And then again, if you wanted to, you could get the DVD2 ISO as well. But with the steps that we're going to be going through in this video, you only really need the DVD1 ISO. So be sure to grab that. Or also, obviously, if you wanted to, you could just grab the torrent file and use your favorite BitTorrent software to grab both the DVD1 and 2 ISOs. Alrighty, let's finally go through all the steps that we need to create the VM and install our OS. So it's actually super easy. The basic steps that we'll be doing are choosing our target operating system, setting the memory and the drive sizes for the VM, and then booting from the ISO image that we just downloaded and following the steps to install the distro. But I'll be going over that in detail so that you'll be sure to install everything that you need. Okay, so let's first install VirtualBox. You'll see here that I've copied it over to my desktop, and I'm just going to double click on it and run it. It's really fairly straightforward, but there are a couple of things that I wanted to show you during the installation. So I went ahead and uninstalled it, and now I'm just going to reinstall it again. So first of all, I'm going to just change it to my D drive because that's where I want to install it. You can install it wherever you want, obviously. And click Next. I don't want a shortcut on my quick launch or my desktop. But again, you can have that if you want. And then I'm just going to click Install when it is all ready to go. And it doesn't take very long, maybe a minute or two. But during the installation, it will pop up a few dialogues that will ask you for verification, such as this. Would you like to install this device software? And it says it's the Oracle Corporation Universal Serial Bus something. It's actually a virtual device driver for the USB. And what these will allow you to do is the virtual machines that you create, these are virtual device drivers for those VMs, so that, for example, if you create a VM and install this USB virtual driver, then that VM will be able to recognize USB devices. So I just install all of them myself. You could in fact just click on Always Trust Software from Oracle Corporation and then just press install, and that will install the virtual driver. And then again, it's asking us for a network service virtual driver. I'm going to go ahead and install that. You don't really need to install all of them if you don't want to. I recommend just going ahead and install them just so that your VM is as fully capable as possible. But for our purposes, for the purposes of this video, you will need to install at least all of the network drivers, because, well, that's essentially how we're going to be able to connect to our VM. We're going to be using, our SSH client and our SCPs, and in fact, we're going to also be trying to connect to it through a web server, or a web client, sorry. So we do want to at least install all the ones that have to do with your network. So make sure to install those. But for the other ones, for example, this one, network adapters, install that one. But for the other ones, such as the USB driver, you technically don't need to install that, but entirely up to you. I install them all myself. And we are all set. As I said, it doesn't take very long, and you could just have it launch VirtualBox immediately after installation if you wish, and it'll take you to this window. Alright then, let's go ahead and create our virtual machine. Now before we actually start, one thing that you might want to do, one thing that I do want to do myself, is to go into Preferences, and you'll notice this virtual machine folder here under the General Preferences. We are in the General tab, by the way. If you want to store your virtual machine files on a different drive like I did, then you might want to change this. Just click on this drop down here, choose Other, and I go over to my F drive because I've set up some specific space for the VM files on my F drive, which, let's see, there we go, my VirtualBox VMs folder on my F drive. So it's entirely up to you. If your C drive is where you want to store all the stuff, then that's fine. The amount of space that they require depends on exactly what you want to do with them. They're going to require, the most space that they'll typically require is just the virtual drive space, because for all these virtual machines, you're going to be creating a virtual hard drive. And unless you want to do something special, then that virtual hard drive is going to typically be just a file on your actual physical hard drive. So if, for example, you create a virtual machine with an 8 gigabyte virtual drive, which is going to be, as we see later, the default size, it's going to create an 8 gigabyte file on your physical hard drive and use that as the virtual drive for your virtual machine. So just make sure that you select a drive that has that amount of space available. So if you want to, for example, make a virtual machine with like a 100 gigabyte drive, make sure that your default machine folder has at least 100 gigabytes free so that it can create that drive. So to create it, these steps are going to be very, very simple and pretty straightforward, but in case for those of you who have never done it before, all you have to do is click on the New button, give it a name. I'm just going to call it E-UNI Dev, and under the type drop down, you want to make sure that you select the type of operating system that you're going to install into it. We are, for this demo, going to install CentOS, which is a Linux distribution, so I'm going to choose Linux. But as you can see, you have a choice of a lot of other things like Solaris BSD, IBM OS2, Mac OS X. Under Other, you could actually also select DOS, NetWare, other stuff like here. But again, I'm going to choose Linux. And then under the Linux distribution version, I'm going to choose, since I'm going to install CentOS, which is essentially Red Hat, I'm just going to choose Red Hat. And since it's a 32-bit Red Hat, I'm just going to choose Red Hat without the 64-bit next to it. And then click Next. Now we choose the amount of memory that we want to allocate to our virtual device. 512 is kind of constraining, so I usually set it up to at least a gigabyte, 1024 megabytes. And in fact, I usually don't set it to higher than that unless I want to do something that specifically requires a whole ton of memory. But feel free to set it to to whatever value that you feel is best for you. I'm going to click Next. Oh, and one reason I actually set it to a full gigabyte is that I'm also going to be installing a desktop, and I'll show you and tell you exactly why when we get to that part. But the next part is choosing the hard drive, and typically you don't need to change any of this. The recommended size of the hard drive is 8 gigabytes, like it says here, and it defaults to having you create your virtual hard drive right away, which there's really no reason for us not to. So I'm just going to click on Create. And when choosing any of these, just keep it as a default as a VDI, VirtualBox disk image. You can choose one of these others if you want, but there's really no reason to unless you have unless you know what it is and you have some specific reason to choose one of these others. So just leave it as a VDI and click Next. Now the storage you can either set to dynamically allocated or to a fixed size. The only difference is that a fixed size, if we choose fixed size, it'll automatically create a file that is the entire size of our virtual hard drive. So if we choose the default 8 gigabytes, for example, and we choose fixed size, it's going to immediately create an 8 gigabyte file on our hard drive. Whereas if we choose dynamically allocated, it's just going to make a file on our hard drive that is the minimum amount that it actually needs. And then as we use up more space on our virtual hard drive, it's going to just expand the size of that file. I typically just set mine to dynamically allocated, but again, this is entirely up to you. If you wanted to allocate the entire full size of the hard drive, of the virtual hard drive right away, you could just choose fixed size. Click on Next, and here's where you can give it the size and the name of the drive itself. Default is going to be 8 gigabytes, but you could obviously bring that all the way down to just 4 megabytes, which by the way is not going to be enough to store your distro, so don't bring it down that low. Or you could bring it all the way up to the full size of your physical hard drive. My physical hard drive is 2 terabytes, but there's definitely no way that all 2 terabytes is free at the moment. I really have no good reason to change it away from 8 gigabytes. As a basic development system, 8 gigabytes is pretty much plenty unless I plan on doing some really serious development on it. By the way, you could use this slider or you could just type it out here. So I'm just going to type 8 and then press create. And that is pretty much it for actually creating the VM itself. You could see your list of VMs is going to be here on the left side. We could see that there's an E-UNI dev VM, and that is currently powered off. And when we select it, since it's the only one here, it's automatically selected, we could see all sorts of information about the E-UNI dev VM. So in order to actually use it, and in our next step to install the distribution, we just want to press the Start button while it's selected, by the way. Now, one of the things that you're going to see a lot, unless you select Do Not Show This Message again, is that you have the Auto Capture Keyboard option turned on. This will cause the virtual machine to automatically capture the keyboard every time the VM window is activated. Essentially what that means is that since this is a virtual machine, anytime that you click on it, well, if this dialog wasn't forward, I'm just going to hit OK. But essentially anytime you click on it, then all the input will go into that virtual machine. And then you actually have to tell it to stop receiving input. And by default, the way to tell it to stop receiving input is to just tap your right control key. And I'll be showing more details on that later on when we actually start the OS installation. But for now, let's take a look at this. Select your startup disk. Now, this is the disk that it's going to, essentially it's the disk that it's going to boot from when it starts up this VM. Now it's going to default to probably, if you have an optical drive on, then it's going to probably default to that optical drive. Right now the E drive is my DVD drive. But what you want to do is change that. So click on this little folder selection icon here, and you want to navigate to and select the ISO files for the distribution that you just downloaded. So for us, it automatically went to here because this was where I last selected something. But I'm going to now select the DVD1 ISO for the CentOS 6.4 i386 that we just downloaded earlier in this video, and I'm just going to click Open. And the name of that ISO should appear in here now, and then we could click on Start. So now it is running our virtual machine. You might also see this. It says the virtual machine window is optimized to work in 32-bit color, but the virtual display is currently set to 24-bit. You could safely ignore that if you're not going to be doing some major graphics within your virtual machine. If you're just going to be using it for basic web development, then feel free to just ignore that. But essentially this here now that we can see here, I just clicked in the window itself so that it's receiving my input, and now I'm using the up arrow and down arrow keys to change my selection. This is essentially what you would see if you would have actually booted off of the CentOS 6 DVD. So this is actually a virtual machine now running, well, essentially running the CentOS 6 installer. So to install CentOS 6, we want to go to the first one, install or upgrade an existing system. I'm going to hit enter. It's going to go through its entire startup thing. And here's another VirtualBox message that you will probably see a lot, unless again you choose Do Not Show This Message again. And it's basically telling you what it kind of said earlier about the keyboard integration, but this is for mouse pointer integration. And the thing that you need to know about this one is that you need to capture the mouse by clicking over the VM display or pressing the host key in order to use the mouse inside the guest OS. Well, that's fine. Essentially what it's saying is that, our mouse we could be using inside of our actual physical system. We could right click on our desktop, etc. But if we want to capture mouse events inside of the virtual machine that we're running right now, we need to click inside the virtual machine. Well, when this dialog isn't in front. So when I click the mouse inside the virtual machine, well, it's a text interface, so you can't actually see a mouse right now, but it is actually capturing the mouse events inside the virtual machine. And like I said earlier, if you want to stop capturing keyboard and mouse events, you want to tap your right control key. And now our mouse is back in our actual physical machine. It's being captured by the actual machine. So let's go ahead and continue installing CentOS. CentOS installation has a media test, but we're just creating a virtual file on our current hard drive. We really don't need to do that media test. So I'm just going to go to skip and hit the space bar to select it. And then it's going to go through the installation steps. I'm just going to move the window up a little bit. But here's where the mouse capture. This mouse cursor right here is actually the mouse cursor of the virtual machine, and the one that's actually moving right now is the mouse cursor of my Windows system. So if I click in the virtual machine, it is now capturing the mouse events like I just mentioned a little while ago. So now I could use its mouse to click on the next button. And most of this early stuff is really straightforward, so I'm just going to breeze through it. I'm selecting English as my language. Click Next. I'm using a US English keyboard. Click Next. I'm just going to set it up for basic storage devices because I don't have any special devices in this virtual machine. Clicking Next. It's saying that it's using a hard drive that's called ATA VBox hard disk, which is the VirtualBox hard drive. And yes, I'm going to click on yes, discard any data because we already know it has no data to discard anyways. For the host name, I'm going to go ahead and give it a name for the host name itself, but I'll keep the domain as local domain. But I'm going to call this E-UNI dev, just so that later on I could identify it by its name instead of seeing localhost all the time. So it's just something I typically do with virtual machines so that I know right away which virtual machine is actually running if I have multiple of them. And then I'm going to click Next. Actually, there's a Configure Network button down here. If you click on it, you can see that you could do a little bit of configuration with the with what network devices it detects. And in fact, we probably should do that right now. So I'm going to go ahead and do it now. What you should do is you'll see an ETH0, which is the virtual. It's actually what it is the virtual device driver that is emulating an Ethernet connection inside of the virtual machine. So select that and go to Edit. And you can keep everything as default, but what you will want to do is select Connect Automatically. And that way you don't have to actually manually enable your Ethernet 0 device every time that you reboot your machine. And then just click on Apply. Then we will close and then go to Next. And then it wants you to select your time zone. My nearest city on this map is Los Angeles. So I'm going to select Los Angeles and go click on Next. And then set up your root password. And click on Next. In here, basically it's asking what do you want to do with the space on the drive. We don't have anything on the drive for sure, so we could choose either replace all existing Linux systems, which there are none, so it'll replace everything, or just force it to use all the space on the hard drive. Both of those will do exactly the same thing. On the lower left here, if you really want to encrypt your system, I guess you could really do that. You could review your partitioning layout. We won't do that for this demo, and we'll just click on Next. And then it'll give you final verification. You're about to wipe out your partition, but we just made a virtual partition, so we'll just go ahead and click write the changes to the disk. It's going to go ahead and gyrate through all of its setup and then take us to here. This is where we want to I want to go into a little bit extra detail because we want to make sure we select the right packages to install so that we can properly set this virtual machine up as a testing and possibly development host as well. So the way we want to do that, what I do is just set it up as a web server, and that will ensure that it installs the Apache web server and also PHP. And then I will go down to this radio button at the very bottom for Customize Now. And that will allow me to do further customization to install the other things. And in our case, the other things are things like the MySQL server. Of course, we could have just chosen database server and then chose Customize Now and then selected the web server, or whichever way you want to do. So for this demo, we'll choose web server, but we'll also choose Customize Now because we want this VM to be more than just a web server. And we may as well install all of the packages right now during installation, instead of installing just a web server and then manually installing MySQL and so on and so forth. So I'm going to hit next. And since we chose Customize Now, this is where it's going to let us select all the different packages that we want. So what I typically do, well, first of all, since we already chose web server, if we click on web services, we should see that all of these are already selected, including what we want, web server and PHP support. But the first thing we want to make sure that we do is go to databases, and we want to make sure that MySQL database server is selected. So there's our MySQL database server, but feel free to go through all of this and see what other packages that you may or may not want to install. And one thing that I always like to do is go to desktops and actually install a desktop. Now this is one of the reasons why I allocated a full gigabyte of memory to this virtual machine instead of the default 512 megabytes of memory, is that desktops, if you install a full desktop like I'm about to do, it will have a little bit of trouble running under just 512 megs of memory. But it seems to run fine with a full gigabyte of memory. So what I do is typically I'll choose a desktop. I'll choose the general purpose desktop, which is like it supplements the standard desktop here. I will go ahead and also choose some performance debugging tools, graphical administration tools, because if I ever want to admin my VM, then I could use the tools in the desktop itself instead of opening up a terminal and having to type out a bunch of commands to do all of my admin stuff. You may or may not want to support install the desktop platform, additional fonts. If you don't like GNOME, you might want to install KDE instead, and so on and so forth. Under applications, I also like to install my graphics creation tools so that I also have a graphics editor. But more importantly, I also like to install my internet browser so that I can actually browse inside the VM instead of having to switch out all the time to browse using my my physical system if I really wanted to. Entirely up to you. And again, you could just go ahead and click on all of these and see what other things that you might want to check out. You might want to check out development. If you're the kind of developer who likes to use Eclipse, you can select it here so that it installs Eclipse. There are other development tools. It doesn't really give you any details here, so usually for all these other things, I will just install them manually if there are other things that I want to install. You can select different languages and so on and so forth. That's typically, if I remember right, all the things that I typically install. There might be something under servers. Yes, the one thing I also usually install personally under servers is the system administration tools. But again, that's entirely up to you. And then I believe that's pretty much all I set up myself. So I'm going to go ahead and click Next. And here's where it actually goes through all of the different packages and installs everything, and it probably will take a little while, even though it's entirely running off of a hard drive. So it's going to be much faster than, and if you're used to installing a Linux distro off of a CD or a DVD, you know how long it could take. This is installing completely off a hard drive, so it's going to be much faster, but it might still take a while because, as you can see, we're going to be installing 1164 different packages. So I will pause this video here until it gets to the end, and I'll pick up again when it gets there. Okay, we're back again, and it is almost complete. In fact, it's just installing the last package now and finalizing the installation. And here we go. Okay, and I guess that was about it. There really wasn't anything else to show. Congratulations, your CentOS installation is complete, and just press the reboot. Oh, well, again, click in there so that you can capture the mouse and then press reboot. And because this is a virtual machine, you actually don't have to reboot your actual physical machine. The virtual machine itself will fully reboot itself. Again, the message on mouse pointer integration. You'll see this every time you start up your VM. So just click on Do Not Show this message again if you do not want to show the message again. CentOS 4 should start right up. Or my apologies, CentOS 6. And these last final things are essentially just final configuration. We'll go forward. Yes, agree to the license agreements. Now, you want to create a user for yourself because you do not want to log in as root all the time. So I'm just going to create a username for myself and set up my password. And click forward. I'm just going to synchronize date and time over the network. It defaults to some CentOS NTP servers. That's fine for me. Click forward. And wait a bit while it sets up the NTP services. It'll tell you that there's insufficient memory, but it's only for Kdump. And Kdump is something that you don't really need. It's essentially a kernel dumping tool in case the system crashes. But since we only gave it a gigabyte, it's not going to have enough memory to enable it, but we don't really care about it anyway. So just press OK and ignore it. You'll get this info about Kdump. It'll not allow you to enable it, but just click Finish. And after another few more seconds of gyrations, you will have the login screen. So you could just click on your user and type in your password. And it should bring you right into, well, if you set up a desktop, then it'll bring you right into your desktop. And there we are. If you did not install the desktop itself, I mean, you could, if you really like the command line, you didn't necessarily need to install the desktop, and it would have just brought you to a login prompt for your command line. And that's it. We have set up a VirtualBox running CentOS 6. Okay, now that we got the VM up and running with our OS of choice, we need to take a few more steps to make it accessible from the outside using our standard set of tools, like our SSH client and our web browser. So we'll go over the exact steps to disable the software firewall, to make sure all of our required service daemons are running, and to forward the proper ports. Okay, now that we have our virtual machine running, then we could go ahead and do whatever the heck we want with it. Actually, this is our own personal Linux computer anyways, a computer running inside a computer. Our little Linuxception system. I'm just going to go ahead and do a little bit of customization because I'm OCD that way. Actually, I don't really do a whole lot. Let me show you at least. Here is your standard web browser. It installs Firefox by default. And it'll open up your Welcome to CentOS and Welcome to Firefox windows. I'm just going to go over to Google and do a little bit of quick customization. Look for, let's say space images. Look for a decent one. So typically when I set up a, when I customize my desktop, I look for a very dark, hey, Horsehead Nebula. I look for a very dark background to use as a desktop image. This is, well, it's not quite that dark, but I'm just going to go ahead and use it for right now and set it as my desktop background. I could look for something a little bit darker later on, but I'll just use this for now so that I don't take up too much video time. I'm just going to go ahead and customize my terminal. Oh, yeah, for those of you who don't use the GNOME desktop before, to open up a terminal, if you really want a terminal, you just right-click anywhere on the desktop and choose Open Terminal. And I'm just going to quickly customize this terminal profile preferences. I'm going to just set the color to a green on black, and I'm going to set the background to transparent with closer to maximum alpha. So yeah, you could just set up your terminal windows, and you could open up as much as you want. This is essentially, like I said, it is a your own personal Linux desktop system. So some other things that I'll point out to you, the applications are where if you installed, for example, your graphics package, this is where you could find GIMP, the new image manipulation program. Your web browser is here under Internet, but as you could see, it also puts it up on the title bar. And under programming, since we selected Eclipse, you could find Eclipse under programming here, along with a few other things. Well, okay, let's go ahead and go to the last part of this video, which is going to be how to set up this system for access, for external access. Because, like, for example, if we open up our, remember, right control to release the mouse to your host operating system. But if, for example, we open up Firefox, we want to be able to essentially connect into our Linux system with both Firefox, and if we use it with our SSH client. I use PuTTY myself, so I'm just going to open up PuTTY. But I want to be able to connect to this using both Firefox and PuTTY, and to do that we of course have to open up ports 22 and 80. To do that, we've got to do 3 steps. First of all, we want to disable its own software firewall. So I just clicked in it again, and I'm going to go to System Administration Firewall. There it is. And it just says this will let you set up a firewall. For all these admin level tasks, you will have to type in the root password again. Just a security measure. But for the firewall, we just want to click on Disable. So presumably your outer system is secure. You know, in my case, it's my Windows 7 system. It's secure. It has its own firewall, and in fact, I'm using a hardware firewall through my router. So you really don't need this software firewall. I didn't apply the changes. So do not quit yet. You want to click Disable and then click Apply. Clicking the Yes button will override any existing firewall configuration. Yes. So we'll kill CentOS's own little firewall. Now we also want to make sure that the services are running. The services that we are interested in are, of course, Apache, MySQL, and SSH. So we want to go to System, Administration, Services. We'll open up a little window, and we want to look for those specific services. So first we will look for HTTPD. There it is. Select it. By default, we see that it is not enabled and not started. So we select it, click up here in the upper left on Enable, and again, type in the root password. Click Authenticate. So we've enabled it, and now we also want to start it. So click on Start. And then here under HTTPD, we want to make sure it says this service is enabled and this service is running. So that is our web server. We now want to look for MySQL. Here's MySQLD. Again, select it, click Enable, and click Start. Service is enabled, service is running. And then finally go down to SSHD, which typically it enables and starts it by default, but we'll want to select it and make sure the service is enabled, the service is running. So our 3 services are now running correctly. We've disabled the firewall. Now what we have to do is tap right control again to release the mouse, and you'll notice that there's a menu up here. This is the VirtualBox menu, and then right below it is the actual virtual machine system. So this menu up here is the Linux desktop menu, but this menu up here is the actual VirtualBox menu. So in the VirtualBox menu, after releasing your mouse to your host operating system. What we want to go to now is devices and go to network adapters. Under network adapters, it'll open up your general settings, but it'll immediately go to network. Adapter 1 will be by default selected to NAT, network address translation, with the cable connected. Don't change any of that other stuff, but just click on port forwarding. And under port forwarding, we want to add two new port forwarding rules. So click on this plus to insert new rules on the upper right. Rule 1 we're going to call, well, double click on here to change the name. We're going to call it HTTP. And we're going to set the host port to 80 and the guest port to 80. And we'll just keep everything else default and blank. Then we're going to click plus again, and we're going to set up one for SSH. We'll call it SSH, guest port 22, sorry, host port 22, guest port 22. And then press OK, and press OK again. And that should be it. Now we should be able to, for example, under PuTTY. Oh, also one more thing. I'm going to open up a window, sorry, a DOS box under Windows. And I'm going, that's actually not what I wanted to do. I'm going to open up my control panel for my network. So go to Network Control Panel, Network and Sharing Center. You'll notice two things here. Well, possibly more than two, but you'll notice at least two. Your own LAN, which is probably how you're connected to the internet. But you'll also notice an unidentified public network out here called a VirtualBox host-only network. If we click on that and go to details, we'll see some information here, but most importantly we're going to see that the IPv4 address is 192.168.56.1. This is essentially the IP address to get to your virtual machine, because your virtual machine is using the VirtualBox host-only network right now. So I'm just going to go ahead and close that. I didn't want to change anything there. All I really wanted to do was take a look at that number. But now I could use PuTTY to go to 192.168.56.1. Since it's a brand new host, it's going to ask you for an RSA2 key fingerprint. You want to save it, click yes. And now I could actually log on as myself. Whoops, wrong password. And I'm in. So if I even do a uname A, I could see that I am, in fact, on E-UNI-dev.local domain. So now I can connect to my virtual machine from my physical machine. And now we could also go into Firefox and connect to 192.168.56.1. And we can see that we are the Apache 2 test page powered by CentOS. So we can actually connect to it through port 80 as well, which is the default HTTP port. And that is it. Now we have a virtual system running. If we open it up, this is just the screensaver. If we move it around, we could see that we go back in, which is another customization I forgot to make, is to disable that silly little screensaver because I don't need it. Which we can do under, where was it? Preferences, probably. There it is, screensaver, and deselect activate screensaver when computer is idle. Or you could choose a different screensaver or whatever. But again, we now have a virtual development environment. It is now running Apache, it's running MySQL. We can connect to it through SSH. We can actually connect to its web services. By default, again, we're running Apache, so it's putting everything into var www. So we should be able to, for example, HTML. We should be able to, for example, vi and index.html and say this is a test. It should work without proper markup, shouldn't it? Oh, yeah, of course we're logged in as ourselves right now, and we don't have write access to this. But again, if we we probably don't have. All right, let's just do this. There, we've relogged in as root. We are still in the HTML directory. You'll probably want to change this properly later on, but as just a quick test to make sure it really is set up correctly, we'll just create a quick fake index.html, tap on our right control, which will take us back out to here, and then reload this page, which now displays this is a test. So we have verified that it is in fact working correctly. So all right, we now have an environment where we have all the appropriate pieces of software set up. Later on, I'll probably also make a video to further customize this system, like for example how to set up the appropriate databases. At the very least, probably a video on how to set up the Eve data dump into MySQL on this server, and so on and so forth. But for right now, this is the very basics of getting your development environments set up and running. So hopefully this has been useful to future E-UNI dev team and maybe to a few others as well. So this is Turnbay. Until next time, signing out.